going to tell you that I'm Barbara DeMarco Barrett. I'm the president of Sisters in Crime Orange County chapter. Sisters in Crime, as many of you know, maybe all of you know, was founded by mystery writer Sarah Paretsky in 1986. And since then, Sisters in Crime has advocated for women crime writers. We have 4,500 plus members, I believe, and membership is also open to men. Membership is reasonable. It's $50 a year to the National Sisters in Crime, and each chapter has its own thing. So ours is $25 a year, so it's tax deductible. Lots of perks, webinars, all sorts of things on the craft and business of publishing. So you can read about the perks at sistersincrime.org. But today is all about Noir. Pat did a wonderful presentation on film Noir. Really appreciate that. I should have recorded it, of course, but I didn't. And our panel celebrates the publication of Palm Springs Noir. Here it is. There it is. By Akashic. Akashic has published something like 110 anthologies of noir short stories from around the world. So if there's a place you're interested in, look it up. I bet it's been done. It's sort of a great prelude to traveling, right? You can read about the dark underbelly of the place you're going. And if it hasn't been done, you might want to put a proposal together and approach Akashic, which is how Palm Springs Noir came about. I wanted to read short stories that took place in the desert, and I couldn't find one. And so I approached them, and at first they said, no, we're not ready for domestic noir. And I went back, I think 6 months later, and they're like, well, we're still not ready. And I went back 6 months later and they were ready. And that's how it came about. So our panelists, of course, came into the project pretty early on. Some I knew, let's see, I think somehow Eric and I were in touch because he does noir at the bar and he's going to talk about that later. And others like Eduardo and JD Horn, I think word of mouth, maybe Todd Goldberg told me about. No, actually, Eduardo, it was Mary Camarillo told me about you, and JD, it was Todd. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. And Eric Beatner is the author of more than 25 books and more than 100 short stories. A few of his titles are Rum Runners, Two in the Head, and The Devil Doesn't Want Me. Eric also hosts one of my favorite podcasts, Writer Types, which features crime writers always. And he also is the host of Noir at the Bar that takes place in LA and maybe soon to be in person again.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. He's been nominated for 3 Anthonys, an International Thriller Writers Award, a Seamus Derringer, and 5 Emmys. And he's a member of Sisters in Crime, the Los Angeles chapter. JD Horn is the Wall Street Journal bestselling author of the Witching Savannah series, the Witches of New Orleans trilogy, and the standalone Southern Gothic horror tale, Chivalry. His novels have received global attention and have been translated into Turkish, Russian, Romanian, Polish, Italian, German, and French. He lives with his spouse, Rich, and their rescue chihuahua, Kirby Seamus. And Eduardo Santiago's first novel, Tomorrow They Will Kiss, was an Edmund White Debut Fiction Award finalist. His next book, Midnight Rumba, won the New England Book Award for Best Fiction. His short stories have appeared in Ziziva, Slow Trains, and The Caribbean Writer. His nonfiction has been featured in the LA Times, The Advocate, and Out Traveler magazine. He's currently program director for the Palm Springs Writers Guild. And before we start talking about Palm Springs Noir and all sorts of things, if you care to purchase Palm Springs Noir, and we hope you do, if you prefer a brick and mortar store, in Orange County, Book Carnival carries it. In LA, Skylight carries it, and in San Diego, Mysterious Galaxy has it with signed book plates. All stores will ship, and online, it's everywhere. So I'm so excited to talk with Eric, JD, and Eduardo. I've read their stories at least 3 times, and I still love them. So I think that's saying something. Each time I read them, I discover something else. Let's begin with each of you reading a page or a page and a half of your stories and say whatever you like about how the story came about. Eric, do you want to begin?
I do not, because my book's over there. So
Okay.
someone else start. I'm going to grab my book.
Okay. I'm looking for a place. Okay. So I'm sorry, you guys. This is I'm trying to find a place that that a student asked me about the other day because I assigned a story. Basically the story starts out in first person because a lot of noir writing is first person writing. And then the book, the story jumps to third person. And then I'll tell you a little bit about that. The cat burglar was not at Circle K that afternoon. Just as the meeting was wrapping, Kimberly Miller, her actual name, was riding shotgun in a truck, sailing down the mountain on her way to Indio, the lowest of the low desert, with every intention of getting to the night market before the sun came up. The truck wasn't new, and she had to cram her shit in the space not occupied by bags of chlorine and leaf skimmers, but it took the mountain roads with ease. Behind the wheel was Justin Alvarez, the only friend she had left from down below. Even as she got in the truck, she knew he wouldn't be her friend for long. She just needed him to stay her friend long enough to get to Indio. They'd met in Palm Springs 5 years ago when she still had a house and a husband, a kid, and a teenage pool boy. Justin was no one's idea of what a Palm Springs pool boy might look like. At least he wasn't her idea of what a Palm Springs pool boy might be. Bernard, that's her husband, had passed on the tanned and muscled blonde who applied and hired the one that mostly resembled an adolescent garden gnome. He was fully bearded man now and taking the mountain road with ease. They were well out of Anza in no time and traveling through the pine tree forest that linked Anza to the desert floor. She wondered how much fighting and screaming Justin had witnessed in that house with the manicured cactus garden in the crystalline pool. So that's the ankle of Anza. Kimberly is, as it says there, a cat burglar. Like I said, the story was in first person. And then at that moment in the story, it becomes third person. And I'm not really sure why. I was just inspired by that line because they're all looking for her. And now we're in her head, but in a different way. And you know, that's just craft and technique. And I planned the first person narrative, but I did not plan the third person. What I did is I went with it and I turned it in that way. And I thought that if it didn't work, my editor, also known as Barbara, would let me know. But she didn't. I never heard back. I mean, I heard back, you know, that she was going to publish it. And I just think that sometimes as artists, we need to, you know, take these risks. I mean, I know that it doesn't seem like a large risk, but it was a risk anyway, you know, to veer from the convention of first person narrative. So.
All right. Thanks, Eduardo. JD, let's hear from yours and talk about a bit about how it came about.
Well, first, I have to say that I've yet to see a pool boy in Palm Springs who looks like a pool boy is supposed to look. And second of all, I'd like to apologize because when I wrote these words, I didn't anticipate having to say them out loud. So this is for my story, The Stand-In. I learned about the Kennedy assassination while I was stripping for the prison guard. Donna waited for the line to land, then sensing a tough room, stepped it up. tits out and squatting in front of this Mack truck with vagina, and she just burst into tears. The kid sitting across from her couldn't be more than 30, corn silk hair, weak chin, done up like a newly minted missionary in a white short sleeve button up, shifted in his seat but said nothing. Donna didn't make a habit of letting just anyone into her house, but after the kid called 2 days earlier and asked to meet her, she got help at the senior center looking him up on the internet. She found his resume, a fancy school followed by a meandering mishmash of jobs, pictures of him and his girlfriend drinking beer in Puerto Vallarta, pictures of him and his girlfriend drinking beer in Portland, videos of their tiny mutsy whatever a doodle dog. The kid seemed rudderless but harmless. He was interested and Donna was bored, so she figured why the hell not? She talked to him. Besides, Sally was waiting nearby if Donna needed her help. It was July. She turned off the AC to discourage a too long visit. Outside it was $1.20, and even with the shades drawn and the ceiling fan turning, it was pushing 90 in her kitchen. The smell of fresh paint, one of her boys had talked her into letting him paint her cabinets while white and the wall behind it chartreuse because one or the other would pop, lingered a full week after the work, growing sharper in the mounting heat. It was starting to get to her, but the kid didn't seem bothered. A fat fly that had followed him in buzzed overhead, circling like it was waiting for permission to land. A grown damned woman, she mumbled, at her own enthusiasm waning. Bawling. Donna had been dining and drinking on the story of her incarceration and the events leading up to it for 50-odd years. The kid's dubious stare wasn't the reaction she'd come to expect. So when Barbara contacted me to see about if I was interested in writing a noir story, I believe I literally responded, I think you have the wrong writer. And then she said, oh, Todd said you could do it. So, okay, Todd. So I know there's 1,000 ways why this isn't true, but I've come to think of, I write mostly Southern Gothic. And in this process, I've come to think of noir as Southern Gothic without the drawl. And it's sort of the same thing. It's the violence, the people with maybe higher aspirations, but the beer budget to support it. So as far as crafting this story, I just kind of rely on characters coming to speak to me, and Donna just sort of talked to me. And she began to tell me her story about how that she was an actress and how she never made it, and she'd come to Palm Springs and got involved in a situation that wasn't good for her. And I showed this story to Todd Goldberg, and he's like, nah. Change the end, make her the killer, and it'll be noir as F-U-C-K. So that was the thing that pointed me towards the end that the story has. And I sort of backwards engineered from the story I started with and found out that it hooked together much better and was much more interesting. So thank you, Todd.
Eric.
All right, I'll read a short section here. My story, The Guest, is about a guy who lives in LA but has an income property out in Palm Springs, and gets that dreaded phone call in the middle of the night that something is wrong and he needs to come immediately. His guy who's the caretaker of his house has summoned him back out to the desert. So when he arrives, he finds this. A shadow moved across the patterns of rippling water. Randall looked down into the pool. A body floated face down. When he turned back to Grayson, there was a smear of blood across his lip where he'd chewed his nails until they bled. Randall tried to keep his voice even and calm, despite the sheer panic going on inside him. What happened? Grayson spoke in a voice that was half whine, half pleading for his life. He was staying here. He was fun and nice. Randall's pulse quickened until it made his chest ache. We were having fun, Grayson went on. He liked me. Grayson, what happened? We were drinking and we did some poppers. Poppers, Jesus, what is this, the 90s? I fell asleep. When I woke up, he was like this. Randall turned back to the pool and looked at the floating body. He was young, early 20s. His shirt floated open around him like delicate wings catching a breeze. Beneath the fabric, Randall could see he was slim and broad-shouldered like a swimmer, someone who never should have drowned. It was an accident. Randall said the words out loud, like maybe he was trying to make them come true. Yeah, it was an accident. He must have had a heart attack or passed out or maybe hit his head or something. Did you even try to revive him? It had already been hours when I woke up. Randall crouched down, sitting back on his heels and staring at the water. What do we do? A single cricket chirped from the planter bed, and the sound bore into Randall's ears like a needle. For all the romanticism around a chorus of crickets at night, a solo insect could drive a person to insanity. So that's starts off that story. And when, like the other guys, when Barbara called me about doing this, I guess opposite to JD, I jumped at the chance because noir is what I love. This is the sandbox that I love to play in. I've written a ton of noir short stories. So some of my novels are definitely noir. So I immediately started thinking of ideas. And my experience in Palm Springs has been as a visitor, as someone who goes out there on weekends. I've been out there with my family. And so I come and go. And so I sort of understood the transient nature, I think, of Palm Springs. And I think that's what led me to a story about, a weekend getaway that goes wrong. So.
All right, I'll read from The Water Holds You Still. Okay. When I returned with the groceries, well, I'll set it up. Let me set it up. My character, Greta, has been called by her mother. Her mother has been hearing things and seeing coyotes and various things in her Palm Springs yard, in her home. Things are disappearing. And so Greta decides to go visit her mother. And when she gets there, the cabinet is bare. She has to go to the store. When I returned with the groceries, Mom was on the sofa paging through a Palm Springs life. Out by the pool, a man was skimming the water, sweeping leaves, bugs, and crud into a net. He wore khaki board shorts, a neon yellow rash guard like what surfers wore, and a wide-brimmed straw hat. He looked to be pure muscle, calves striated like rocks carved by river currents. He moved fluidly as if to his own soundtrack, swished the pool sifter back and forth. "That's Ernesto," my mother said without looking up from the magazine. I put away the frozen foods and went out to introduce myself. He was tall with eyes the color of kiwi. He said he attended pool 3 times a week for the last 2 months. "That's a lot, isn't it?" I said. "It's what the man wants," he said. "What man, my brother?" "Ben," he said his name was. "So the house could go to hell, but the pool needs to be pristine." Interesting. "And you are?" he asked. "Greta," I said. "It's nice to meet you. I'll leave you to your work." I turned toward the house. "Que bonita," he said softly, perhaps to himself. "What?" Rather shyly, he said, "You're much more beautiful than your picture." I felt flustered, then dizzy, then smitten. It happened so fast, like I had been hit with the flu. "How'd you see my photo?" "Your mother asked me to look at her stereo. Sound wasn't coming out. Your photos were on the wall above it." "Do you want a drink?" Was I hitting on him or had he just hit on me? "A cerveza would be nice," he said, so hot. He wiped a red bandana across his forehead. "I don't think there's beer, but I'll check. I have wine." "Whatever you like, I like," he said. So I was looking over my notes for the story, and I started 2 other stories before this one came to me. And, they were just, 10 pages of this, 10 pages of that. And it just wasn't working. And I don't know how I wish I had taken notes about how this one even came, because I feel like it came fully formed. I was in Palm Springs at the time, staying in the house that I set my story in. And I remember just staring at the pool a lot. I mean, I love swimming, I love water. And some of you know this, I become worried about electricity with swimming pools, especially if I don't know that they've been examined or made sure they're up to code. And who does that? I don't know. A lot of the swimming pools out there are old, built before 1963. And so I wanted to do something I hadn't read about. I'd never read in a story. And then I did a bit of research about swimming pools and electrocutions, and if that was possible. And well, you're gonna have to read my story to find out what happens. But I'm curious with all of you if, or how much setting shaped your stories. I mean, could your stories have taken place anywhere? Maybe let's go backwards this time, Eric.
Well, I think my story, like I said, the idea of a place that you get away to, a place that's an escape. I mean, the character in the story is living in LA, but gets away to the weekends, has this income property. He's thinking of it as a place he's going to retire. So this is Palm Springs to him is an oasis, as it is for so many people. It's a place to think about sort of living a better, maybe hopefully quieter life. And then, of course, in the story, all that crumbles. And I think in a great noir story, setting up someone's expectations for having, a dream of a better life, only to have that rug ripped out from underneath them, is always a great place to start with a noir story. So yeah, setting in the bigger picture, setting became very important. And then, look, anytime you're going to set something in the desert, automatically you got people who are starting to sweat, and that also makes a great noir story, especially if they're trying to cover up a murder.
JD. JD.
Yeah, I don't think it could happen at least in many other places, because the story is so dependent on Palm Springs and its sort of golden era Hollywood kind of vibe, and how it has faded and become something entirely different, that Palm Springs life sort of reflects Donna's life. So I don't think there are any, at least maybe the Hamptons in New York, but it's still, kind of what it started out to be. So I'm going to say Palm Springs is the only place.
What about you, Eduardo?
I think that when you contacted me to submit a story for this anthology, I was not living in Palm Springs, but I've been going to Palm Springs since I was a teenager, because I grew up like an hour away, and I was intrigued. And but I lived in Idlewild, which is on the mountain above Palm Springs. And there's a highway there called the Palms to Pines Highway, or the Pines to Palms if you're going backwards. And I said, well, there's a little town here called Anza that I could write about, and it's the high desert. So we agreed on that. And I think I needed Kimberly the cat burglar to be able to go up and down that mountain from the desert to the high desert, and again, back again. And so I don't know that I could have used another setting that has that immediacy of going from temperate weather to incredibly hot weather in 45 minutes, like that. But I wanted to ask Pat a question. Is that okay?
Sure.
So Pat, my story has been singled out for having a lot of humor in it. How much do you think humor generally plays into noir? Because I'm thinking about one of my favorite noir movies, Double Indemnity, and that banter that Stanwyck and McMurray have, which is, I can actually quote that stuff, and so other than that, can you think of other places where humor is essential to the story?
Well, I felt funny, it's me, right? I'm the right person you're talking to. Since somebody, I'm not sure who brought up, Carl brought up Body Heat. Body Heat has a lot of humor in it. If you take a look at Body Heat, there's a lot of humor, most of it involving the supporting characters. There's some funny exchanges involving a waitress, this diner that they go to a lot. Humphrey Bogart was great with throwaway lines. He and Lauren Bacall used to do it all the time. And Double Indemnity has the banter, including some with Fred McMurray and Edward G. Robinson, who is his mentor in the film, who's on to him, by the way, so I think that there is a level of humor in film noir not in every film, but I think a number of them have a kind of also a wry sensibility to it. So I think it works. I think it works. Now, there's also films that parody, film noir, and there were some of those made in the 70s and 80s that were put-ons, of film noir and stuff.
Yeah, like
So-
Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid.
Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, The Cheap Detective, things like that. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid is a funny example. But I think it can work in the genre. It probably for me, I tend to like things serious for some reason. But it does work in the genre. It has a history of having worked in the genre. So
Right.
yeah,
Okay.
thanks for
Yeah,
asking.
it's hard for me to write without humor.
I think Eric too, because Eric's story is also funny. And I think you said you didn't intend for it to be funny, Eric?
No, I rarely intend for some of the things that I write, but I've heard that a lot, and I do think it gets down to that sense of you're writing something that hopefully ratchets up the tension to a point where the audience then starts looking for a release valve, and they might find humor in something that is very dark, but if you set up a character and you sort of pile on to a character and things go from bad to worse, people can often see that as a humorous turn. But I think part of it is just that sort of natural human instinct to need to loosen the tension a little bit and kind of laugh at someone else's misfortune. And any noir story is just rife with the reader hopefully thinking, oh, there but for the grace of God go I, so that I'm not in this horrible mess that this person is in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give away your ending. I'm just going to say that the way that events keep piling one upon the other, upon the other, upon the other, it is definitely hilarious, and the sweat and it's also incredibly tragic.
Yeah, not hilarious if you were living it. But
no, not if it was you, right? Yeah.
So JD, why did you choose Deepwell? Because I think Deepwell, it was your idea, right?
It was because when I first moved to Palm Springs, I live here part of the year and San Francisco part of the year. And we didn't think we were going to like Palm Springs. We were moving down here to get out of a bunch of snow we accidentally found ourselves in. And so it turned out we fell in love with Palm Springs. And so we had started with a small condo in Deepwell. And so I knew the area fairly well. I walked my Chihuahua around it all the time and I talked to people. And so got to know a bit of the history about what stars lived where and that kind of thing. And so it seemed like a natural fit to put Donna there because it's an interesting combination of really fancy done up mid-century modern and a few that are kind of run down and still owned by the same plush carpet first generation to own it kind of situation. So that's why I like Deepwell because I think it is sort of central, it's both on the map and sort of spiritually central to Palm Springs.
It's a pretty historic neighborhood, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a lot of the old movie stars live there. And it's funny too, because growing up, when you think of Hollywood and you think of these fancy homes and things, I had, I guess, like the Clampetts in mind when I was coming here or something. And they're just sweet little houses. But when you think about the history of the people who lived in them, they're just amazing historically.
Yeah, historical in a California sense, where
hello,
the middle of the 20th century is history.
Right. Yeah,
they're great on the curve. Hey, California, Southern California, they're still standing, 50 years later. That's something in and of itself.
That's right. That's a landmark.
So when, I think all of you were in for at least part of Pat's talk, but I'm curious, noir, what we're doing with Palm Springs noir and contemporary noir is so different from the films. So what is noir for you? What was noir for you writing these stories? Anybody can jump in.
I'm afraid the noir for me is the movies, the Sam Spade kind of movies, the black and white ones, the Maltese Falcon, all of those that I grew up watching. And so that's part of the reason I was so intimidated by this, because I'm like, I can't come up with a hard spoken gumshoe and a femme fatale. It's just not what I write. So I was happy to have people help expand what noir could be for me, because I had a very limited boxed in view.
Well, that's interesting too, because I know you're working on a domestic thriller.
I am.
But you're a writer of paranormal for the most part.
No witches or ghosts or vampires this time. This is a domestic thriller. So I hope to be borrowing a little bit from what I've learned. What's amusing is that right after I wrote this story, there was a call for a Christmas themed horror anthology. And I wrote a story and submitted it, and the editor said, oh, I liked it, but it was too noir. So if anyone has a noir Christmas thing coming up, let me know.
What about you, Eduardo?
I did a lot of research because I'm not a noir writer at all, and I do enjoy the noir movies. So I got a collection of Dashiell Hammett novels. It was all in one book that I found at the library, and I read Harvest, which has the most amazing plot and the most amazing femme fatale, and it's never been made into a movie that I know of. And if it was made into a movie, it wasn't made under that title. And that really influenced me a lot. The cynicism of that story, of that novel really influenced me. And I was looking on Facebook. Okay, so ANZA is a real place, of course. And ANZA has a Crime Watch Facebook page. And I saw this thread that said, we have a cat burglar here, and we believe it's a woman, and this is the stuff that she's doing. And at the same time, or right about the same time, I met this woman in Idlewild who was really beautiful, like very put together and whatever. And it turned out that she was a recovering drug addict and alcoholic on leave from Betty Ford Center in the desert. I didn't even know that recovery places send you on leave.
On leave.
You know, like go get fucked up, you know. So she told me her story, and I said, oh, I need to write something, and can I use your story? And she said, sure. So I combined the two, plus elements of, you know, my own life and experiences and the needs of the story, right? Because you can take facts and put them down on paper, and it's not going to make an interesting story unless you have all these, you know. I needed the pool boy to be unattractive, for example, because it meant that her husband didn't trust her with a hot pool boy.
Where are these hot pool boys you keep talking about?
JD, they're not in deep well. That's all I can imagine. But Barbara saw one.
Yeah,
so, you know, so they're out there. They're out there.
I have seen one. I have seen one. That's
have to
what my
audition
guy came
them.
about. It's like, okay, all right.
Yeah, yeah. There's the Hello Hotness pool service that you get them from. So so that's sort of how my story came together. Like all these events and people started to happen to help me create the story so that I could be in this anthology. That's all I can think of.
What about you, Eric? What's noir to you now?
Well, this is a world that I'm steeped in. I know this world very well, both the books and the films. But the ones that I've always been more drawn to are veering a little bit away from the detectives and the cops. As much as I love those stories, I'm definitely more drawn to more of a Cornell Woolrich or Lionel White, Charles Williams kind of style that takes ordinary people and, you know, puts them through the worst day of their lives, and also takes ordinary, just sort of sad suckers who try to reach for the brass ring and it all goes wrong. So I'm definitely of the mind to start my noir style stories with just your average Joe, and either through their own greed or their own, you know, hubris, they get involved in something that it takes them, down a rabbit hole and gets them tangled in a web of their own making. Those are usually the most interesting stories to me. So I think when I began this story, I knew that's what I wanted to do. I right off the bat, it's sort of, it's like doing a sculpture. You whittle away the pieces that you don't want first. And so I don't want to do a cop. I don't want to do a detective. I don't want to do a period piece or any of that kind of stuff. And you're left with, okay, what's just an average guy that therefore then the average reader can be reading your story and think, oh, geez, what would I do in that situation? Because it's not so far removed from hopefully the life of the person that you're putting this story in their hands. So those are the stories that lure me in more than any other.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And you've said that you outline your novels. Do you outline short stories too?
Not as such. I mean, I like to have an idea of where it's going, or at least I'll sort of start and I'll get, maybe halfway and I sort of know, okay, this has enough legs to make it. I honestly can't remember if I knew how this one was going to end before I started. I don't think I did, but I give myself the freedom to leap before I look on a short story in a way that I'm much more regimented in a novel for sure.
Hmm. What about you, JD? How much did you know? Did you know where it was going?
As I said, I thought I knew where it was going. And I, in the first draft, and then I talked to Todd about it, and he had some input about shifting it and shifting the perspective a little bit. And I think it really did become a much more interesting and sort of, I don't want to say powerful, but more just, it has more of a hump to it, than the original version had. So, yep, Todd helped.
Eduardo?
No, I mean, I had the character, I had the setting or the two settings, but I didn't really know all the stuff that happened. And, you get inspiration and then your own creativity and your own training and what happens next and what happens next. And you start discovering the story. I discovered the story as I went along, and I discovered the ending when I wrote it. That's pretty much the way it happened. I just allowed it to unfold in my imagination. And there's something about, I don't know about the other writers, but you know how you know that it works? You write something, you're like, okay, this is good. Okay, this is good. Okay, this is not good. It was sort of like that, and yeah, so it was really fun. I mean, Eric, I can totally get why you write this type of work. It's really, really fun.
Oh, it's fun torturing people, right?
Absolutely, yeah. But as far as my own personal experience, I think Janet Fitch's story is much more like something that I've experienced personally. So her story was very, very touching to me. We talked about it the other day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. JD, you said that your characters talk to you. And I heard you say this the other night too with your novels. You said, you listen and your characters talk to you. Can you say more
yes,
about that?
If they ever get my medication adjusted, my career's over. That's how I know when it's good. When the characters start talking to me and they want to show up and they want to be there and they will make suggestions. Sometimes I'm like, boy, you're a masochist, aren't you? But yeah, that's how it starts working for me, is when I start hearing them, feeling them, and just kind of know that they're in the process with me. So I always feel like I'm collaborating, even if I'm just writing by myself.
Does this happen
Mhm, mhm.
like if you're in a quiet spot or you're walking or running or swimming or whatever, or do you are you like, talk to me?
No, I sit down and start writing, and the voices, whatever character I'm writing about, they'll either show up or they won't. And the funny thing about me with running is that that's what I like to do when I'm stuck on a plot point, because for some reason running will help pop something out that once I get my mind off it enough and just sort of fall into a regular rhythm of something else. But yeah, no, my characters, they either like to play with me or they don't. And sometimes, I've had characters that I've written out. I've had like a third or, half of a book, and a character is just not wanting to be there. So I write it out and see who wants to come and take their place. And usually it's the right choice for all of us.
Yeah.
Do your characters talk to you, Eduardo?
My characters show up in person a lot of times. So when I was writing this, friends of mine got a hotel room for me because they were in Palm Springs and they wanted to visit. And I woke up in the morning and my window faced an alley. And I looked down and Kimberly was there. Like the homeless version of Kimberly was there. And she looked up at me. And I still get chills when I think about it. And this has happened before where I've been, writing a character and I have seen that character show up in a novel that I wrote. What I love though is, when they start talking in dialogue. I love when my dialogue just starts to, that somebody says something and something, like the two guys at the meeting at the beginning. When they're just talking and they're bantering and the guy uses all the obscenities and so forth. And it's just such an exciting thing, when that starts to happen. I'm sure, Barbara, when you wrote that stuff between the pool boy and Greta, and they're, do you want a beer? Do you want this? And there's all this subtext, and she doesn't know who's picking up who. And that's the beauty for me of writing. I mean, you write the descriptions and all the narration because you have to, but it's all about the dialogue for me.
Right.
Yeah.
It's great fun when that starts. What about you, Eric? Do your characters talk to you? Do you hear them?
I've never characterized it that way, but I think it's, in a way, however we all talk about it, it does happen in a similar fashion, because I know I have a terrible writing process that I never recommend to anybody, but I think about a book or a story. I'll think about it for weeks or months, depending on the size of the projects. You get an idea, and oftentimes I don't write anything down, which is probably dumb. But if it's still there and it still keeps popping up weeks later, then okay, I know I'm onto something. And then I'll start to plot out and I'll start to map it and be like, okay, is this really a thing? And then I know I'm ready to truly begin. Just like they were saying, like when you have those moments where you're in the shower and you're writing the scene in your head, and this is the times that I need to keep either a notebook or a recorder or something. Like I don't know, I'm sure you guys have gone through the same thing. I've lost great chapters that come, like you say, Barbara, fully formed in my head, and only because I'm not near a computer or a keyboard, or I'm driving or something like that. And then, but you hopefully, like once it all starts coming uninvited into your head, that's when I know, okay, I'm ready to go. And when I do sit down at the keyboard, it's going to be there because they're already piping in with the dialogue and with the ideas. So yeah, I think it's, no matter what name you put on it, it's a similar process.
So is that why you don't take notes? Because you want those characters, a situation to bother you, to bug you, to return, to show that it's serious?
Yeah, I think, look, we all do what works for us, and that's worked for me in the past. I also think I have too many ideas already in, half finished outlines or just jotted down things, or, the file that I keep of potential book ideas. So, in a way, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to get to you for a long time, so quit bugging me. But then if someone is insistent enough and they keep cropping up and they keep trying to talk to me, then they'll sometimes jump the line, and that'll be the next thing I write, because they're telling me, hey, this is ready to go. It's time to get going. And then if I'm trying to write something else, the voice doesn't necessarily go away. Or sometimes, and I'm sure we've all had this thing, sometimes I'll write something and get it out just to get it off my mind, just to get it out of there and be done with it so I can move on to the next thing.
Interesting. Okay, so Maddie has a question, and if anybody out there has questions, put them in the chat. Maddie says or asks, do you ever have concerns about writing protagonists that are unlikable?
No.
That's all I ever want to write. That's, I'd like them to be unlikable by normal standards, and to have all these issues and problems, and then figure out a way to not necessarily redeem them, but to make them relatable. in some way, right? Because if they're that unpleasant, then you don't want to follow the story. I never ever really want to write about a super nice person who does super nice things. So.
What about you, JD?
Well, I think it's kind of genre dependent because when I was writing the story, I was absolutely fine with writing someone who might be considered unlikable by other people. But when you're writing for a certain type of reader, you have to get their sort of liking the character right up front, or they're going to just drop the novel. Like when you're dealing with, say, contemporary fantasy, most of the times you have to have a protagonist that the readers will be looking to identify with on some level. And if it's not a likable character, even if you try gently to move them in that direction, they will probably not like your book. So I do worry about it when I'm writing certain types of books. I'm not in the least bit worried about it writing this domestic thriller. So I hope that people really dislike one of the characters.
And I'm going to guess that, Eric, you have no trouble writing protagonists that are unlikable.
No, I no qualms, but I do think one of the challenges in any book is, if you're writing a character who's who's potentially unlikable, I like to try to find a way to then bring them around and humanize them. And I've written a lot about putting the criminals forward in the books, and the criminal is the main character. So they're doing something that's illegal. They're doing something that's potentially abhorrent. They may have killed somebody. They may have killed somebody for money. But if you can use your skills as a storyteller to then turn that character into someone that the reader is rooting for in a way, despite the abhorrent things that they've done, or you've justified the things that they've done, then I think that actually makes a really interesting character that readers latch onto very deeply, because now you're invested, and it's almost like you're in cahoots with them. You've gone to the other side of the lawlessness with them, and now you're along for the ride in the shotgun seat. And I think that's a fun place to be.
Well, I think with all three of your stories, your main characters, I didn't find them unlikable. I mean, they're all complicated. And so I think maybe that also saves a character from being just unlikable. If you can show their complications, right? As a character, that they're not just one thing, one level. Carl asks, how much do your stories change in the revisions?
As little as possible.
All the time.
As little as possible.
I revise so much that they come into focus for me. I think revision helps my characters just come into focus.
Well, on a project, oh, go ahead, JD.
So I'm a total pantser. So my revision is my writing. I can't, once I plot something out, if I do an outline, the story's dead. So I have to kind of discover the stories and moves along. And I will have what most people will call their first draft is probably my fifth or sixth draft of something. And that's the first time I'm willing to let someone else see it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a lot like Eric in that I let the story live in my mind a really long time, so that by the time I put it down, it's there. And then the revisions are basically about making it tighter, making certain things more clear. I had to work very hard on getting her up the mountain and down the mountain, and things of that nature. And I think that when you're working on a story like this, where you have a finite number of words that you can use, then the revision is basically about meeting that quota for me in this instance. I had one of the other, somebody who's not here, who's sent me his story and said, can you please help me shave 500 words off of this without losing the thread? So we were all concerned about that. Because how many words did we have, Barbara? 6,000?
You had, yeah, that was max, 3,000 to 6,000.
Max, yeah.
So Diana asked, do you ever like your villains so much you don't want to kill them off? And Noir doesn't have, the villains aren't the same, I think, as in other crime fiction, right? I mean, I don't think of my people, my bad people, bad, whatever that means, as villains. But maybe, do you think of yours as villains in noir?
Victims of circumstance is more accurate.
Yeah.
Right.
And you know, they do bad things. Mine does bad things, definitely.
Usually those are the characters that kind of, maybe they skate through. You don't know what's going to happen to them. It might not be good what happens after the story ends, but
I've
we don't
definitely
know.
had that in novels where if I'm writing someone who I'm willing to give them character traits that would paint them as a villain, if they're going to do bad enough things that they're going to be the antagonist in one of my novels, then they probably deserve everything that's coming to them by the last page. So I've never felt bad
Yeah.
about anything I do to those people. They ask for
Yeah.
it.
I want to ask another question of Pat. Pat, are you ready, Pat? So a lot of these movies that you talked about were written and produced under the Hollywood code, right? And so the bad person had to pay, right?
Right, that's true.
Usually with their lives.
Yes, somebody
but-
has to pay, right.
But in 2021, the stories that we wrote are our antagonists didn't necessarily have to pay in order for the story to be published or even to be made into a TV movie or whatever. So that gives us also freedom about what our antagonists are allowed to do and get away with and so forth.
Right, because in a neo-noir, you have different standards that you're dealing with. You can also use language, and you can have sexual situations that were hinted at, but not, they were done obliquely in film noir. You have women dressed very mannish in some 40s films. It's great. I mean, and they're tougher than the guys, but nobody's going to call them a lesbian or anything like that, or whatever they are. But there's strong hints. Yes, you're absolutely right. That there was a code, there was something called a production code. It really erodes in the 1960s because of partly the French New Wave, things like that. But yes, it was, and by the way, because I think you mentioned Red Harvest earlier, which you read to kind of get going. There actually was a 1930 version called Roadhouse Nights. I'm thinking about that. I think it's called Roadhouse Nights. It was made by Paramount, but they did it as a comedy with music, and I'm not kidding on that. But if you want to see Red Harvest on the screen, and it's like Lawrence Kasdan did with Body Heat, which was kind of an homage to Double Indemnity. Akira Kurosawa, the Japanese filmmaker, made a film called Yojimbo in 1961. It is essentially Red Harvest.
Yeah.
And in mid-90s, 96, Walter Hill made a gangster film called Last Man Standing, and it is Red Harvest. And he's
okay.
So anyway, you can kind of look around, you can find that,
Okay, thanks.
I'm always fascinated too, like when you get down to that sort of that very cliched vision of what a film noir is. Everyone always likes to talk about the downbeat ending, but I think that people do kind of lose sight of that, because far, far more of these films squeeze in a happy ending right in the last 3 minutes. If you look at the films that have a truly downbeat ending, there's about 24 film noirs and that's it. But a lot of them are really, really noir, and they're really, really dark up until, oh nope, they're gonna kiss and they're gonna walk off. They might leave like a body of the partner of the detective laying in the ground, but you still get the kiss and the walk away in a lot of these films.
And part of that had to do with the standards of the day. Also.
Yeah,
they had to leave you with a little something. But I mean, I'm always wondering, gosh, are they going to live in the suburbs? What are they going to do? What's their life going to be like?
Right.
What's happening to Laura and the detective at the end of that? What's their life going to be like? So I often wonder about that. How do you have a great life after that. So, but that's true. That's true. They gave, it's called the Hollywood ending for a reason.
Right.
Mhm, mhm.
So Maddie has a question, and you all are novelists, so, and you've written short stories. Are the standards different for short story versus novel form for you?
I do think I think short stories are allowed to be a little bit more nihilistic and darker. I think you can get away with that because you're not asking someone to invest, 300 pages of reading time in, potentially unlikable characters or just someone doing despicable things. And I think you can get in and get out with it with a short, sharp punch, and do something that's probably darker than you can sustain for the length of a novel, for sure.
I think it's easier. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, JD.
I think it's easier with a short story to do something that is haunting for the reader later, because like you were saying with the novel, it's hard to achieve that and keep it going. But with a short story, you can get in and do a punch and just walk away.
Mm-hmm. And leave it unresolved in a lot of cases. It's easier to leave a short story unresolved and still have it work.
Yeah, I thought my story in this anthology had a resolved ending, but it's been pointed out to me that it's unresolved and I should probably turn it into a novel. And I do like the character and the setting enough to take a crack at it. So I'm really considering doing that.
So would you just continue on from where you ended, or do you see?
I think that I'm going to have to take it to where it is, and then go back to more specific times, and then come forward. But I haven't figured it out 100% yet. It has to marinate a little longer, but it's something that has been pointed out to me several times in the since the book was released.
I wonder, along the lines of what you were talking about, Eric, a lot of the James Cain novels are very thin,
Yeah.
So much noir, those novels are maybe 50,000 words at most.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And because I think about, noir is kind of the least popular of the crime genres, right? I mean,
today, I think it's the bloom's off the rose a little bit right now. I mean, I'm fingers crossed for a comeback, but
Right, yeah, that's right, because the none of our stories have gore, in them, or extreme, like decapitation or anything like that. So there's room for improvement.
Well, it's interesting as someone like going through film school and being with my contemporaries. I mean, I feel like an old man now, but at the time, when I was in the 80s and 90s and I was loving classic cinema, people would say, oh, it's dated, and some people write off, I think, black and white films, and some people write off a book from the 30s or 40s as like, it's going to be dated, and like, yes, okay, there's going to be rampant misogyny and probably some racism and some horrible things in there that you have to sort of read past. But the ability to do all the violence and the profanity and the nudity on screen and on the page, I think led to an explosion of that kind of stuff where people were unchained. So you see a lot of the books that came out in the 80s was sort of the highlight of that, men's adventure fiction, the Mac Bolan and the guy who's got a machine gun and he's just going to mow down everyone in his path. And things got so over the top. I think that's where it started to take a turn. And as much as I like a story that's very dark and does some terrible things, I actually like the restraint of a studio film from the 40s, or a book like Postman that seems like it sizzles on the page, and yet there's not a livid sex scene in there. It's all implied. It's all a little bit behind the curtain. And I actually admire that. And I think if we brought that back, I think it would bring some of the readership back to these kind of stories. Because I think it got a little too over the top for too long. And a lot of readers walked away because it was just too much.
Mm-hmm.
someone at a panel the other day, someone who was attending asked about Noir and how explicit is it? And I think he was expecting something other than what it is in this anthology, you know? I
Yeah.
mean, I think like along the lines of what you're talking about, he thought he didn't like Noir because he says, you know, it's just too explicit. It's like porn. I'm like, it's not porn.
Right.
Yeah, we're very far from porn in this anthology.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's this great diversity, you know, and it's very casually presented, you know, the different sexual preferences of the characters and the ones that are sex workers and things like that. I mean, there's very little judgment in this anthology. Somehow, and I don't know how that happened, Barbara, if you just chose all these like ultra liberal, you know, people to write your story.
Say.
Good
Just-
writers.
Yeah, really, definitely good writers. Great stories. JD, I wanted to ask you about your character Donna, and I wanted to know there, you know, I'm not going to give away what happens, but I wonder if you could talk. There's a moment where there's a point of no return for her. And I wondered if that moment occurred to you before you wrote it, or if you were surprised.
No, for someone who spent the last hour talking about how he never plots anything, that was the one thing I knew I wanted in this story, was that I wanted her to be reduced to the absolute most basic thing she could be seen as. And I wanted her to react against that. And someone calls her a nice little old lady, and that's the last thing she wanted to hear. And I think, you know, it's basically, she's afraid, her biggest fear is being irrelevant and being unwanted. And he summed that up for her in one sentence. And I think that's, that was one thing I was aiming for.
It worked very well.
Thank you.
Carl asked, do your villains ever become heroes?
I think, yeah, I've certainly written about people who would seem to be like, if you describe who the character is, you would think you're describing the villain, but it's actually, I put them and make them the hero of the story. I think that, you know, I don't know that I've ever had anybody change midstream, but I certainly like the challenge of putting a character forward who is on the wrong side of the law or is doing something questionable, but you figure out a way to make them the hero. Because, you know, there's that famous quote of everybody's the hero of their own story, right? So you could take somebody who is, you know, a career criminal or a killer for money, and you could make them the lead character. There's no rules against that, as long as you make that character interesting and relatable in some way.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely doable.
And you have, you know, my favorite trope, which is redeemed by love.
Yes. Or when in doubt, a tiny dog.
Save the cat. So, but definitely, you know, I mean, fiction writing is all about your characters changing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and changing again and changing again. If you're writing noir, right? It's about that. The twists and turns of these lives in a short period of time. It's another thing about our short stories is they all take place in a very short period of time. I think JD's takes place in one afternoon.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So Eric, tell us about Noir at the Bar.
Oh, yeah, it's Noir at the Bar is a live reading series that I've been doing for, good grief, 10 years now. It's our 10th year we've been doing it. And we get together 4 times a year, 5 times a year sometimes. There's a bar down in Culver City called Mandrake, which has been our home base for the whole time that we've been doing it, except for the past year or so. We've had to do some online events. But, you know, I started it after some other folks across the country had started the idea and coined the phrase. The original one started in Philadelphia. A guy named Peter Rozovsky, you know, put that alliteration together and did sort of it was kind of like a writer's salon kind of night. He did that for a little while and it didn't last. But then a couple of writers in St. Louis, Scott Phillips and Jedediah Ayers, picked up the name, asked Peter if they could use it, and they started doing events there with 5, 6 writers on a bill. They would get together. They did theirs actually at a local bookstore out there. And I had never attended one of those in St. Louis, but I heard about it, and I know those guys pretty well. So it was when the mystery bookstore in Westwood here in LA, I don't know if anybody remembers that bookstore, but it was a real home base, I think, for LA crime writers. And it was a place that you could go to readings and meet other writers. I loved going there, and right at the beginning of when I started publishing, I was getting to meet not only writers that I admired very much and being able to ask advice, but just getting exposed to new writers. And then, as we all know, the bookstores are all closing down one at a time. So when that closed, all of a sudden this gathering place, this central hub, vanished in a city as big as LA. So I wanted to try to do my part to bring a place where we could all gather again. And so it's very much, for me anyway, we have a bookseller on site. We do sell books, and we want to introduce people to new writers and who have something new out usually. But it's about getting together with both your fellow crime writers and then readers. So I keep the readings very short. We do a lot more mingling than we actually do reading, but usually have six to eight readers on a night, and we get together in an actual bar, and we have a really good time. So it's great. I hope that we can get back to doing them in person very soon.
Yeah, me too. That was fun. We have a few minutes left. If there are any other questions, throw them in the chat. And maybe in closing, I'm curious if your experience of Palm Springs has changed at all since you wrote your stories.
Next time I go out there, after reading Todd's story, I'm going to be looking for clowns every corner.
I know.
I was
Yeah.
in a restaurant and that guy walked in once, and I am terrified of clowns.
Really?
I've had this firsthand experience.
Oh
yeah.
no.
What about you, Eduardo?
Well, I've been going to Palm Springs for a really long time, and I've always known that that Palm Springs had this seamy underbelly, and in fact, in my younger days, I was part of it, and no, it hasn't changed. I've always seen the crime and the addiction, the people who come to Palm Springs directly from prison, and continue, to get up to, all the no good nicks. No, it has not at all.
Well, I want to thank you for being here, taking the time, and want to thank everyone who's in attendance for spending Sunday afternoon with us. And again, the book is available locally at Book Carnival, in LA at Skylight, and in San Diego at Mysterious Galaxy. So thank you all for being here, and hope to see you at the next Sisters in Crime meeting. And tomorrow night we're at Mysterious Galaxy, actually. So yeah, see some of you there.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
everybody.
Bye.